Hey everyone.
Hello.
Oh,
Caitlin, I realize I need to rename myself. Connie, are you using Barb's link?
no, Mathoni is using Barb's link.
Ah, okay. Anna, can you send me the full name?
Connie Gonzalez.
Oh, I mean, to rename Barb.
Oh, yes, let me send you Mathoni's full name.
Sorry, guys. I didn't receive the link and Barb shared it with me. I realized this morning I did not receive the link. I've just renamed myself.
Oh, perfect. It's no problem at all. Thank you for doing that.
By the way, Anna, can you see the translators? Because they say they're waiting in the waiting room.
Carmen? Carmen's in the waiting room. I don't see anyone else in the waiting room.
Okay, okay. Let me write them again.
Hi, I am one of the interpreters, but I don't see myself in the list.
Oh, yes, Octavian, I don't see you either.
Did I somehow got into the system in a wrong way?
It seems like you used Elena's link instead of your
Yes,
own
yes.
translator
Oh,
link.
I should have used the one sent previously, right? Okay.
Yes. Mhm.
I'll leave it and I'll get out. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
What's the name of the other translator?
Svetlana.
Okay,
Let me write her a message.
She's here. And the name of the other translator?
Octavian.
Okay.
Caitlin, could you please send Connie a panelist link? She's having trouble.
Is Connie available to join?
Yes, Connie is available. Barb's on WhatsApp with her now.
Oh, great. Okay, I got the email from Barb, and I was like reading through the remarks as though I would have to write them. I was a little bit, a bit caught off guard, but I hope Barb is doing okay.
Anna, I sent it to Connie on Slack, or should I send it to per email?
I would send it to both just to make sure she gets it.
Okay.
Muthoni, hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good. Yeah, we're hoping the best for Barb. It's too bad she can't join you in making opening remarks.
No, it's okay. I talked to her this morning.
Oh, good. Okay. Muthoni, if you don't mind, I just wanted to verify the pronunciation of your last name. I know I asked you this in our last event, but is it Kamuyu Ojuolo? Is that correct?
Yep. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, now I am in with the right credentials.
And we can see you.
You can turn me into, if you want, into an interpreter.
For some reason, it's telling me for the language interpretation that the interpreter 1 and interpreter 2 has still not joined.
Yeah, sometimes.
Oh, let me see if I can add you manually. Just 1 second.
Yeah, you can add me manually.
Yeah, we're still missing a translator, I believe.
But you can assign us independently, one from the other.
So I just assigned you.
Okay, yes, I got it. So I'll click OK. And if you want to listen whether there is sound, you can use the English channel. Thank you.
Anna, can you check your Slack?
Yes, I'm looking now.
Thank you. Okay, do we have both of our translators?
Hi. Hello, it's Svetlana. I am the second interpreter. I
Okay.
will just rename myself in a minute.
Mhm.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, so let's test the interpreter function. You both should be added as interpreters. So I'm going to go to the, I'll be on the English channel if someone else could test the Romanian channel. Elena?
I'm speaking on the English channel. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for whom it's still
Eu aud.
Elena, salutare.
Okay, perfect.
Ok, da, Svetlana, te-am auzit pe tine și pe Octavian.
Elena is just confirming that she has heard both interpreters. Thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions about the Zoom platform before we get ready to begin?
Caitlin, I just wanted to flag that Barb says she's going to hang around for a bit in case Connie isn't able to connect, but so we might just be waiting on Connie for the next 2 minutes.
That's fine. I pushed her notification for the Zoom link and I sent it to her per email. I'm going to prepare the live stream.
Who is sharing the slides? I'm sorry if you covered Anna. Okay, thank you. I guess we're also waiting for Charity. Have you heard from her?
I don't see her. Let me send her an email.
Is somebody gonna hand off to me or am I just? Okay, all right.
I will. Okay, we are now streaming. So we will wait a few minutes for anyone watching already on Facebook. We'll get started in a few minutes. Thank you. For anyone just joining us on Facebook, hello again. We are going to get started in just 1 or 2 minutes. We are just giving it a little bit more time for people to access the video and log in. Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this event and thank you for joining us. My name is Lisa and I'm a program officer at the Center for International Private Enterprise for the Europe and Eurasia Division. I am very honored to have the chance to work on the Wage Moldova initiative from SIPE's side and to host you all today at this launch event for the gender and inclusion analysis that Wage has produced. This event is being streamed live on Facebook. We will be monitoring questions on Facebook as well as here on Zoom for those who have joined us on Zoom. So for those on Facebook posting questions, please just make sure that you post on the official live stream on SIPE's Europe and Eurasia page and not on a reposted version so that we can be sure to see your comments and questions. We will now turn to Muthoni Kemuyu Ojwolo and a representative from SIPE Center for Women's Economic Empowerment for opening remarks. Muthoni is the director of the Wage Consortium at ABA Rowley. Muthoni, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and thank you for joining us for this launch event. We're very excited to present the findings of the Gender Inclusion and Analysis, as well as discussing the Wage Moldova initiative. Just real quickly, by way of background, the Women and Girls Empowered or Wage program is a global consortium led by the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative, ABA Rowley, in close partnership with the Center for International Private Enterprise, Search for Common Ground, and Grameen Foundation. Wage implements 10 country initiatives across 15 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And we're funded by the Department of State's Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues. Our goal is to advance the status of women and girls globally. Wage works to do this by strengthening civil society capacity and private sector organizations' capacity in the response and prevention of GBV, by advancing women, peace, and security agenda and promoting women's economic empowerment. Our approach is integrated, it's interdisciplinary and inclusive. Wage also has a transformative approach in that we seek to transform power dynamics between men and women. Our country initiatives implement at the household, community, organization, and government levels. And as such, our partners include civil society, business associations, microfinance institutions, as well as government officials at times. As I mentioned, our approach is integrated, and we achieve this really by leveraging the expertise of each core consortium partner's technical expertise. Such that we're able to work at the intersection of GBV, WE, and WPS. So in Moldova specifically, we work at the intersection of GBV prevention and response and women's economic empowerment, because we recognize that increased women's economic empowerment often increases the risk of intimate partner violence for a woman. And this is in large part because as a woman income increases, it changes the dynamic within the home, at the household level, challenging prevailing gender norms that relegate males to being the sole breadwinner and the sole decision maker around finances. In Moldova, ABA Roli, through our partnership with the Women Law Center, provides expertise in gender-based violence prevention and response to CSOs and business associations, including supporting CSOs to develop gender sensitive and gender responsive policies, and by supporting business associations to prioritize GBV prevention and response in their advocacy efforts, which SIPE will talk about a bit later. SIPE provides expertise in women's economic empowerment and private sector and government engagement to advance a national women's business agenda through legislative and policy reform. All of WAGE's programs, including the Wage Moldova initiative, are informed by a number of assessments, including gender and inclusion analysis, that look at a range of legal, social, policy, economic, and cultural barriers that prevent a woman's full participation in civic, political life, economic life, as well as peace-building processes. So I will leave it here, and we're very grateful that you all took time to join us today, and we look forward to the discussion. And I'll turn it over, I'm not sure if it's Barb or if it's Connie, to provide SIPE's opening remarks.
Yes, thank you, Muthoni. We're turning to Connie Gonzalez, Senior Program Officer at SIPE's Center for Women's Economic Empowerment. Connie?
Great, thank you. I did want to apologize that our director, Barbara Langley, wasn't able to join us this morning. So as Lisa said, I'm Connie Gonzalez. I'm a Senior Program Officer. I work at the Center for Women's Economic Empowerment within SIPE. And help support the team that's doing this excellent work in Moldova. So I'd like to take just a minute to read some remarks that our director, Barbara, had prepared for the event today. Honorable officials, business leaders, and women empowerment activists, it's a sincere honor for me to be with you today. We work at SIPE, as we are more commonly known, the Center for International Private Enterprise. And we represent SIPE within the Women and Girls Empowered, the WAGE Consortium, which Muthoni just spoke a little bit about. So please allow me to extend my best wishes and sincere gratitude to our partners at the Alliance of Women's Economic Empowerment for the Republic of Moldova for their hard work on this project. The Alliance was established in December of last year with the goal of advocating for change that contributes to reducing the barriers to the development and economic empowerment of women, including tackling gender-based violence and harassment. 10 women's business associations and women's civil society associations from this alliance have participated in an organizational capacity program through targeted training sessions, one-on-one mentorship, and a small grants component to increase membership, visibility, and capacity to implement women's empowerment projects. This included training sessions on gender equality and gender-based violence organized by the Women's Law Center, which provided expert support to civil society organizations to mainstream gender equality in their internal policies and activities. Although significant progress has been made in the past year to advance women's rights in Moldova, women still face barriers to achieving economic empowerment. To understand the multiple aspects of social, political, economic, and legal issues Moldovan women face, SIPE and ABA Roli, under WAGE's Reducing Barriers to Women's Economic Empowerment in Moldova initiative, conducted research and analysis of the most pressing issues within the enabling environment for women's empowerment. We are proud to share the publication of this effort with you today. This publication, entitled The Gender and Inclusion Analysis for Moldova, presents the summary of the most important barriers faced by women, the measures which were undertaken to ensure gender equality, and remaining obstacles. Today, my colleagues at SIPE and ABA Roli will present the main findings of the Gender and Inclusion Analysis for Moldova and how these findings will be further used to advocate for women's rights. It is important to understand the root causes of gender inequalities to come with viable solutions and relevant measures to break them down. The gender and inclusion analysis helped to identify the root causes of gender inequalities and forms the foundation of current and future interventions of the Alliance of the Republic of Moldova. The Alliance is also working to combat gender issues associated with the Ukrainian refugee crisis. We know from UN data that women represent roughly 90% of the Ukrainian refugee population. In Moldova, business associations we have worked with under the program have collected and distributed donations, provided free meals to women and children, and participated in dialogue with public authorities. The Alliance will include women refugees as one of the main target groups. Before I turn the floor back to our event organizers today, let me take a brief moment to also thank the State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues for their support of this project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie. Now we are going to move to a presentation of the methodology and key findings of the gender and inclusion analysis. And my colleagues Charity in Whitehead and Yelena Retsoy will be presenting. Charity is SIPE's Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist, while Yelena is SIPE's Program Officer for Moldova, working on the Wage Moldova initiative. Both were directly involved in leading this analysis in Moldova. Charity and Yelena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all who are joining us today. So I'm going to start us off with touching base on the methodology. But before I dive deep into that piece, really want to focus us on what the Wage Moldova project is all about, and which Mathoni started us out with giving us a good general background. But at its bedrock, this project is about reducing barriers to women's economic empowerment, with a very special focus on women entrepreneurs as our main beneficiary throughout. And so ultimately, the goal of our gender and inclusion analysis was to get a foundational background around identifying the successes, the barriers, the inequalities that are currently faced by Moldovan women entrepreneurs, and then using that information to help inform the scope of the activities within the Wage Moldova project. And while much of the research we found throughout the gender and inclusion analysis is absolutely applicable to Moldova women broadly, for the focus of this presentation, we'll be highlighting the key findings that we found which directly impact women entrepreneurs, and will tie into what we're currently doing in the Wage Moldova project, which my colleague Elena will explain in further detail later in the presentation. So moving on to the methodological pieces that we used to pull this gender and inclusion analysis together. We started with first doing desk research, which included mostly looking through gray literature like reports, policy, things like that, working papers, newsletters and articles, academic papers, white papers, and things of that nature, as well as relying on statistics from reliable sources like UN Women and World Bank on the 5 applicable areas that we'll be covering today, which is the laws and policies, sociocultural norms, gender roles and power dynamics, access to and use of financial resources, and gender-based violence from the Moldovan context. And then after we conducted the desk research, we also did our own qualitative data analysis in the form of key informant interviews. And those interviews were conducted in the local languages in Moldova, which are Romanian and Russian. And the interviews were then transcribed and translated into English for our analysis purposes. And we were working with our partners of ABA Rowley. We identified our key informants, utilizing their staff as well as our local partners and stakeholders within the project. And prior to completing the gender inclusion analysis, we also conducted a stakeholder analysis to help us refine and really target who were the folks we really wanted to make sure we heard from as we were pulling this gender inclusion analysis together. And in total, we were able to speak to about 30 respondents from a range of backgrounds and perspectives. Most importantly, women entrepreneurs, but also in-country government decision makers, sociologists, development partners, women's business associations that cater to women or women business owners specifically, civil society organizations, lawyers, and Chamber of Commerce representatives. So now I want to move into the first part that I'd like to cover today, which is on laws, policies, and institutional practices. So the main thing that we found as we were going through the gender inclusion analysis is that Moldova actually does have quite a few excellent laws on their books that are very much promoting gender equality from a lot of different facets. But the big thing that we ran into as we were looking through the data and talking to people was that while a lot of these laws were on the books, ultimately there wasn't a lot of execution, or there was not a lot of ability for some of these laws to truly be implemented in the ways that we would want and we would expect to see them. So for instance, we have a quote here on the screen from one of our respondents who was a lawyer who we spoke to, that noted that there's the law, but we do not have enough financial means to implement it. Secondly, the government doesn't have the infrastructure. So while a lot of those key laws that we need and want and all countries should have, are there, the execution is not quite there. And some of the laws and gaps that we found in our research was the fact that, self-employed women are not entitled to maternity benefits. And we'll touch later on the impact of childcare and the role of the women in the household and how all those interplay. But, the fact that there are women who then don't have access to those maternity benefits if they choose to be entrepreneurs, that can be a big barrier, right, to them being able to achieve those goals and fully operate in the business space. Along with, the legal definition of sexual harassment is very narrow and doesn't fully comply with what we typically see across international standards. And so when we touch on our GBV section, I'll go in further detail to that piece, but definitely when you see things like this, or the fact that the contravention code, reduces the criminal liability of perpetrators of domestic violence, and ultimately restricts women's access to criminal justice when they bring forth cases related to gender-based violence. These are things that, definitely need to be addressed and are going to limit and impact, women in general, but women entrepreneurs as well, as they, go about trying to do what they want to do in Moldovan society in different aspects. And certainly also, we saw how other laws, I want to flag this too, other laws that we saw related to this, that we saw the gap, right, between laws on the books, but not having the resources. People or respondents we spoke to also, attributed this to, staff turnover within the government, not good cooperation between the ministries about who's handling what, and in general, persistent gender stereotypes and things of that nature, and not enough specialized services, especially for people who are part of vulnerable populations. So all those things together, really become that perfect storm, right, of not being able to completely address a lot of those inequalities that we see, especially related to the economic opportunities and things of that nature, and particularly when it comes to marginalized populations, as I just mentioned, and which in Moldova is mostly the ethnic minorities, like the Roma woman and things of that nature. So while, as I said, there are those laws in the books, there isn't a room for improvement. And in fact, one of our CSO respondents recommended that there's a need for better gender impact assessments of new draft laws, and how that type of process being implemented could then help address a lot of the gender inequality gaps that we see when the government of Moldova does design these new laws. And then on top of that, ensuring that there's appropriate, resources that are built into, those laws from the jump so that they can be successfully implemented and we can remove a lot of these gaps that we're seeing now. So wanting to move on now related to sociocultural norms, beliefs, and perceptions. So the biggest thing that we found here was that there definitely is, persistent patriarchal attitudes discriminatory stereotypes around the roles and responsibilities of women and men, particularly when you look at it from the lens of the family and society. And one thing that our respondents very much attributed that piece to was the fact that there is not a lot of language and training and curriculum around gender equality that's in Moldova schools. There's not a lot of gender sensitive training and language for, media and public officials and things of that nature. And so when you are without that information and without those resources, it definitely will be, a challenge to try and have people think from that lens if already they're not being taught or those ideas are not being presented on a regular basis and, in a really clear fashion that all can understand and come together on. So definitely, you can see that link then between those patriarchal values and discriminatory attitudes and how that gets connected to women's educational and employment choices, the wage disparities that we saw through the research, unequal participation in the private and public sector for leadership positions for women in business. And of course, the high rates of gender-based violence that we had already touched on earlier, and we'll go into further details later, along with just in general barriers to, female entrepreneurship, right? And so the fact that, we're walking into the society, right? And these are already the thoughts and the general, I'll say the general consensus of the group, although I will say our respondents who we talked to, many of them did lean more towards the gender equality side and seeing the benefit of those things. But statistics that we saw that were fairly recent, I believe 2019, still indicated that there was that strong preference of women, should be, in the home, taking care of the children, that should be their focus, and things of that nature. And men should be focused on, going to work and things of that nature and handling the business outside of the home. And so again, there is a lot of overlap, in this section in particular, and in a lot of the areas that I'll be covering later. But one thing I also wanted to say too, because as I said, some of the respondents who we talked to were more on the advanced and I'll say, turning to the gender equality side. There was a quote that I want to share with you now from one of our CSO respondents who spoke directly to this point about how even if those who do want to move forward, right, and do want to, see the world for what it should be, and move their society into that direction, that, they're still socially pressured to stay silent because of what's the societal status quo. And so this CSO respondent said, quote, we just recently started to talk of impact on men of gender stereotypes. And with men from the police or the army, it's the most rigid area for law enforcement structures. So men confess, for example, during the trainings, which I conducted, that they would like to take part in education or to stay with their kids, to be fully involved in family life. But at the same time, they fear being ridiculed by their friends. There are specific names for men who are helping in this way, such as under the shoes of women. These are bad nicknames for a man. It is like touching his masculinity. So I just wanted to highlight that too, that while, those stereotypes, they keep women bound, that they also keep men bound as well, those that are more on the gender equality side. So that's my main point for this slide. I'll move on now to continuing on what I was already talking though about related to gender roles and power dynamics. So the main thing that we found here was, once again, as I said earlier, like all the laws on the books in Moldova are, very much equitable across men and women. And so the labor code is no different from that. And that it does, prohibit family-related discrimination in the workplace, for example, dismissing any pregnant workers, provides for, a very generous paid maternity leave, up to 126 days of paid maternity leave, and their maternity leave can span up to 3 years long in total. 14 days of fully paid paternity leave, and partially paid childcare leave for either parent.
So, Moldovan families in general, are becoming, increasingly aware about the importance of gender equality within the family in this aspect when it comes to childcare, child rearing, things of that nature, and how that can allow, both men and women to pursue their professional goals. And that's mostly, when we talked to respondents, due to the fact that of the introduction of paternal leave in Moldova. But once again, even with these leave practices and the partial childcare credits, right, for parents, in practice, still, we see what I was talking about earlier in that, women are still performing most of the unpaid care work in coordination with men. UN Women's study cited that that was approximately, 4.9 hours per day, and more than men. And only 5% of men, really have benefited from those allowances, right, for childcare credit. We couldn't find why that was, why men hadn't been utilizing it. Based off of what I mentioned to you earlier, it definitely could be related to the stereotypes of, men don't take paternal leave. They don't need to do that, because that's the woman's job. But, we had no concrete evidence to say why that is the case at this point. But what we do know is that they aren't taking it at the same rates as women. And so then that does, as we're talking about now, create higher burdens for Moldovan women to then have to take that mantle of taking care of the children, the household, things of that nature. Related to this also, a woman entrepreneur, she said really profoundly about how, it's always that choice for women and never, men typically, especially if they're married, like they don't have to juggle that piece. It's just expected, right? And while I will say also, and while our focus is, mostly on, women entrepreneurs today, I did want to flag how even still, women who do choose to work in the workplace, we had a couple respondents who spoke to, when they had worked in the workplace before they began to pursue entrepreneurship, how they struggled with, employers who wouldn't create work environments that, would allow them to have a successful work-life balance, like not allowing flexible work, or, workforces that would feel like they're forcing them out, because of that, if they have young children and then they can't have, a flexible work schedule. Or, sometimes there was anecdotal evidence about folks talking about how they were pregnant and then, their employment did get terminated because of that. And, one woman entrepreneur, she spoke to this and she said, quote, a woman gives birth to one child, then another one, and she's on maternity leave for a longer period of time. For many women, this break is quite long. And yet we do not have any state programs that would support early learning for children. Kindergarten starts at the age of 3 and practically up to 3 years. If the woman does not have her relative support, she cannot return to work. And only 5% of women who are on maternity leave can afford to hire a nanny, end quote. So once again, we're seeing how, really there is that gap of like having to take care of the children before they can get into childcare, or into kindergarten, I'll say. And so in that gap, if they're not making enough money, or the childcare credit doesn't cover those aspects. And we did see a lot about how the affordability of childcare is a huge barrier for many women in entrepreneurship and workplace, and in those who are operating in the workplace, and wanting to scale up in that regard. And so, once again, with those gendered stereotypes and things of that nature, that does create a huge barrier. And while I'm talking about, women's employment, we have another statistic that I believe was also from UN Women, which noted how Moldovan women's employment rate is 5% lower than that for Moldovan men. So 45% for women and 49% of men who are currently participating in the labor force, and how that is, the lowest overall percentage for all European countries that they had surveyed at that time. So it definitely is, those interactions we are seeing, and the data and our conversations also showed that as well. Next piece I want to cover, oh no, you can go back in. But the last piece I want to cover just on gender roles here is related to decision-making and financial resources, which will, kind of take us into our next topic as well. But wanting to kind of first and foremost talk about how, once again, like while there's no laws in Moldova about how, a woman should obey her husband, that women can certainly be the head of the household and things of that nature, and that there's no laws that restrict women being able to, manage their own household, control their own income, things of that nature. And we are seeing, an increasing number of Moldovan women, who are both single and married, heading their household, but at the same time, one respondent, she shared something that was, really profound and also really connected to what we were seeing as well. And that, if a woman, isn't in a household, and even if she does have access to, financial resources of the household, and she has a spouse, right, who's supportive of her entrepreneurial endeavors, at the end of the day, and typically she does not usually, when she wants to start her business or things of that nature, have any financial resources herself, like that she either brought into the marriage or that she even generated while in the marriage, right? And so our woman entrepreneur, our respondent, she noted, quote, "There's still a financial dependence on a man. For example, in order to start a business, a woman may need a location that belongs to her husband, or she may want to grow something on land that belongs to him. Most women have this problem. And there's also a financial dependence, because if she stayed at home and raised 2 children, she did not produce anything financial. She produced something else. It is necessary for her to be supported financially by her husband or by her family," end quote. And so again, tying that into how, there are some women who are struggling with being able to have access to their household funds, just, based off of the gender norms and things of that nature that we already discussed. But even when they do have that access, it's still needing to, women have a struggle being able to have financial resources of their own. It's usually somehow still connected to someone else, a husband, another family member, a parent, things of that nature, and how that can interplay with their goals, right? And what they're able to do, and when they're able to do them, and when they have access to those resources. And so that, segues us into our next piece about, access to use and control over assets and resources. So once again, legally speaking, while Moldovan men and women, they have equal property and inheritance rights, there's no restrictions on whether, women can open bank accounts or take out loans in their name. But ultimately, as I was just talking about, Moldovan women do have to rely typically on less formal forms of financing. So such as, family and friends supporting them, applying for grants, and then also applying for loans. And one of the things that came up very, very clearly in our research was that while, women entrepreneurs, they will try and apply for loans or lines of credit, right, to launch, and sustain their businesses. They noted how they often were subject to, additional scrutiny, such as the bank inquiring about their marital status, or requesting other additional information that, typically, most men would not have been asked. And how getting that information was then utilized in the decision of whether or not they were, provided that loan or that line of credit. And again, and this is due to the part that I had, mentioned earlier, that, it's not expected in Moldovan society for women to have, collateral of their own, right? It's not expected for them to have, savings or money of their own, just as how the expectation that, like, oh, they're rearing the children, they're staying at home, and so yeah, they wouldn't have any access to resources. So now they're coming to me for this loan, and like, how do I know that this is a good deal for me, right? And so one woman entrepreneur we talked to, she had mentioned also that even when loans are provided, they're typically not enough for, women entrepreneurs to really do what they need to do to start themselves off. And she had mentioned, quote, typically that they are, small loans. And if they want to obtain larger, longer term loans, then problems start arising as women are much less likely to receive those, end quote. And another woman entrepreneur, echoed this as well. And, her thinking was, quote, "We do think that women are good for small business and not for big businesses. we still think that women's businesses or women-led businesses are a bit different from a man-led business, end quote. And she was speaking to the fact of how, you'll get the small loan, but they're not expecting you to expand, even if you are, a woman entrepreneur. Like, even if you ask for more, it's like, oh, well, we'll give you this little bit, as a trying to be risk averse and things of that nature, and not really, believing that business is going to last, right? And we saw this for women who are on, or who are in small to medium enterprises, as well as the desk research showed that the loan applications made by women who are leading large and well-established companies, that they also were seeing higher rejection rates for loans than those from companies led by their male counterparts. And again, because of that risk aversion of not really believing that this is going to be successful. And so we're not going to, put our money towards this. And it is a shame, because ultimately women only account for about 27.5% of entrepreneurs in Moldova, and typically are on the smaller business side, and things of that nature. And something that our respondents spoke to was also the fact that there's not there are some programs that talk about the financial education pieces, financial literacy, some coaching, things of that nature, but not everyone has access to a lot of those things, right? And being able to find mentors and peer-to-peer networking in order to build your business, in order to learn some of these ins and outs. That wasn't always, the case. And we have a great quote from a woman entrepreneur on the screen here. I'll read it for you now, where she says, most of the time, women lack the necessary knowledge of how to obtain loans, how to find the information, how to find the best sources of financing, how to prepare a loan package, and how to submit this package to the bank. The lack of information about how to access bank credit is further compounded by limited basic financial literacy among women from different socioeconomic strata, including understanding of how to open and operate bank accounts. So definitely we're seeing, those two issues here, not having access to the resources, not being able to get the loans when they are in their businesses, and then, in general, also lacking a lot of the knowledge about how to be successful as women entrepreneurs when they are in that space and they want to step out. And I'll now turn over to my last little segment here of our findings related to gender-based violence. And so just to start us off, we did find that domestic violence is by far the most prevalent form of gender-based violence, and typically that domestic violence was perpetuated in the form of physical violence, followed after psychological or emotional violence. That we have a few stats on the screen here. I'll read them out for you. That 63% of Moldovan women age 15 and older have experienced at least one form of domestic violence, either physical, psychological, or sexual in their lifetimes. And 1 in 10 women experience economic violence at least once, with rural, elderly, and divorced or separated women reporting the highest rates of multiple types of violence. And so this definitely is, something that we saw a lot in the research and heard a lot about in our conversations, as well as, a very significant problem in Moldova, along with the fact that there's also the mindset within even Moldovan youth that, this type of domestic violence, that of, beating one's partner, is justified under certain circumstances. And, that one study we saw had 41% of men and about 19% of women, totally or partially agreed that, there are moments when a woman deserves to be physically beaten for something that she said or done. Right. And so the fact that there is this tolerance of that violence to some extent within Moldovan society definitely is an area of concern. And in fact, one CSO respondent that we spoke to who has a hotline that their organization manages related to this, noted that also the impacts of COVID-19 further compounded a lot of those issues that we were seeing. around gender-based violence and how a lot of the calls to the hotline increased almost 40% during the initial lockdown during COVID-19. So definitely, it's an area that needs some reform, and fortunately, the government of Moldova is aware of these issues. They're aware that many women are typically very reluctant to participate in police investigations due to fear of social stigma, widespread attitudes of victim blaming, lack of trust in the judicial system, and how typically it doesn't believe the victims when they do come forward, right? And so, they are aware of these things in these cases, and there have been a few legal things that have been done to try and address that. For instance, the creation of the criminal code and law number 45, which it focuses on the prevention and suppression of domestic violence in all the ways, and in its amended form recently also includes, additional types of violence, as well as those who could possibly be the perpetrators of that violence. And the law, also provides a variety of support mechanisms for survivors, like emergency barring orders, protection orders in emergency shelters, counseling, comprehensive victim services and rehabilitation centers, and as well as a 24-hour hotline for free legal services. But even with the law stating that these are mechanisms that are now going to be out here and need to be provided, there still wasn't a lot of resources, or I should say funding, that was provided behind those laws, as I spoke to earlier in the presentation. So the fact that, like, while they're saying that there'll be an offering of, for instance, counseling and things of that nature and free legal services, the implementation of, providing those free legal services and who has access to that, we've heard in our conversations with a lot of the respondents that had been very limited, right? It's difficult in order to access those resources. And as I talked to you earlier about the contravention code, how it's written currently, it really does reduce the criminal liability of perpetrators of domestic violence. So even if someone decides to bring another person to court around this area, the way that the code is written, it's a lot harder to prove that that person committed an act of domestic violence against the other person. Which again does not inspire people to want to come forward about those issues and address that, and then continues that cycle of violence and the suffering, right, of the victim survivors that we see in Moldova right now. And of course, we definitely saw how, particularly in rural areas, in certain regions in Moldova, like the issues of gender-based violence were even more pronounced. And so again, like, while there are some laws in the books, there still needs to be services and more funding provided behind a lot of these services and provisions that these new laws have put out in order to really be able to truly address this issue. And there definitely are civil society organizations who also work on gender-based violence as well, and try to fill some of those gaps that are not currently provided by the government, like our partner in this project, Women's Law Center, as well as La Strada. So with that, those were our main findings across the gender inclusion analysis as they related to women entrepreneurs. And I will now turn this presentation over to my colleague, Elena, and she will walk us through how we have taken these findings from the gender and inclusion analysis and applied them into the Wage Moldova project. Over to you, Elena.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Charity. So my colleague Charity had a very insightful presentation on the main findings of gender and inclusion analysis and presented the situation in the field of gender equality in the Republic of Moldova. By the way, I'd like to mention that soon we will publish Romanian and Russian versions of gender and inclusion analysis. So please follow us on Facebook and Twitter, follow Wage Facebook and Twitter page and SIPE Facebook and Twitter page, and there you'll find more information about when the translated versions will be published. How you could notice, the Republic of Moldova has a very good legislation in place, as Charity also mentioned, when it comes to gender equality. But still, women and girls face many challenges. And now I would like to speak about how we will take forward the main findings of gender and inclusion analysis and how these findings will be integrated into an advocacy campaign. Women and Girls Empowered Consortium, led by A.B. Rowley and in partnership with SIDE, supported the creation of the Alliance of Women's Economic Empowerment in the Republic of Moldova. Its main goal is to contribute to reducing barriers to the development and economic empowerment of women from the Republic of Moldova. The gender and inclusion analysis stayed at the basis of the identification of the main issues faced by women, which will be put forward by the Alliance in an advocacy campaign, which will be implemented in the upcoming period. Just to introduce very shortly the Alliance for Women's Economic Empowerment in the Republic of Moldova. We started the coalition building process in September 2021, last year, when we convened the first two roundtables with the participation of business associations and civil society organizations from the Republic of Moldova. During the event, we presented the concept of the national business agenda and practices from other countries on developing and implementation of this agenda. Just very short, the national business agenda is both a document and a process. A document which stipulates the priority areas and the solutions to break down existing barriers, but also this is a process of implementation of an advocacy campaign to transform the solutions into reality. During the events, I mentioned the members of the Alliance brainstormed on some barriers faced by Moldovan women. These barriers were taken from the findings from the gender and inclusion analysis. The inequalities faced by women willing to be economically independent stay at the basis of advocacy process of the Alliance. Also, as my colleagues also said, I'd like to emphasize that women survivors of gender-based violence represent one of the main target groups, and the Alliance will implement advocacy initiatives aimed to solve the barriers faced by these women as well. I'd like to also point out that the goal of the Alliance is unique for the Republic of Moldova. Because, of course, we have coalitions on business issues, we have coalitions for advancing gender equality and elimination of gender-based violence. But the Alliance on Women's Economic Empowerment is the first alliance, is the first coalition which tackles the issues from an intersectional perspective, meaning both the issues faced by women in business and at the workplace, and including women who experience gender-based violence. There are 10 members of the Alliance, business associations and civil society organizations. And when it comes to advocacy process, as I mentioned earlier, the Alliance aims to develop and implement the Women's Business Agenda. As previously said, based on the main findings of gender and inclusion analysis and following the roundtables we had in September, the members of the Alliance were able to identify the most significant barriers faced by our target group. And just to list a couple of these barriers, they are women's access to finance and credit, especially when it comes to women survivors of gender-based violence, support programs for women entrepreneurs, including support for women survivors of gender-based violence, women's access to financial programs and loans, discrimination against women in employment and at the workplace, and harassment at work. All these issues were considered from an intersectional point of view, meaning how they would affect both women in economic field and women suffering from gender-based violence. After that, in order to determine all the subtleties of these issues, we began to develop more in-depth study which would look into these specific issues, how relevant they are for a larger community, and what are the potential solutions. In this respect, we initiated the development of the Policy Advocacy Needs Assessment. This is a study which we started to develop starting from November. And during November and December, we conducted 30 in-depth interviews with the representatives of various business associations, women entrepreneurs, civil society organizations, including organizations dealing with gender-based violence, and governmental officials. I would also want to mention that the members of the Alliance were the most were the primary respondents to this survey, and also they recommended other respondents who could provide an insightful opinion on this. Besides this, we conducted 30 online surveys among the respondents, and currently we are in the process of analyzing the findings and drafting the needs assessment. Based on the findings of the Policy Advocacy Needs Assessment, the Alliance will select a couple of emergent issues, and we will develop and implement women's legislative agenda. By the way, once the Policy Advocacy Needs Assessment will be finalized, we plan to publish it and to conduct an event to present its main findings. So again, follow us and you will be invited to that event as well. The topics which will be covered by the advocacy campaign will cover two aspects, as I previously mentioned, and they will emerge from women's economic empowerment issues and combating gender-based violence field. I also want to point out that the issues from the women's legislative agenda are not covered currently by other organizations or coalitions in the Republic of Moldova. Besides this, I want to say that in March, we launched an online campaign, and during this campaign, we invited other business associations and civil society organizations who identified themselves with the goal of the Alliance for Women's Economic Empowerment in the Republic of Moldova to join the Alliance. Now, I'd like just to reiterate our invitation, and in case participants who follow us today during our event, and if they would like to join the Alliance, please follow us on Twitter, Facebook. There you can find the information about this campaign launched in March, and you will find the link where you can submit your request to join the Alliance, and later we will contact you for additional details. This is very short from my side, and now I'm going over to my colleague Lisa for the questions and answer session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yelena, and thank you, Charity, for the presentation. So many interesting findings from the analysis, and it's really exciting to hear about the next steps, Yelena. Thank you. I would like to ask those on the call today to add their questions to using the Q&A function on Zoom. I see that we already have one question here. So if you have additional questions, please use the Q&A function to add your questions so that all the panelists can see it. If you're watching on Facebook, then you're welcome to ask questions as well. Please post your question as a comment on the Facebook page where the video is being streamed. With that, I will go ahead and ask the first question to our panelists. The question is from Nora Wilhelm. Do these family leave policies like paid leave impact which sectors women tend to work in Moldova? For example, are private companies more hesitant to hire women because they are expected to pay for the family leave and costs associated with adjusting the workplace to be flexible for women? So do we see more women, let's say in the private sector versus public sector, or certain sectors based on the different family leave policies?
I may answer this question, or Charity, you can go ahead.
No, I was waiting for you. I saw you unmuted.
Thank you. Actually, the paid leave. In general, business is more reluctant to hire young women of a certain age during their reproductive age, let's say, because the private sector knows that women may get married and then may take the child care leave. Because the child care leave in Moldova is quite long. Currently, women can take not women, but mostly women take this child care leave. They can take for 2 years and paid leave, and then additional 2 years unpaid leave. This ends up in 4 years of absence of a woman from the workplace. So mostly private sector, they cannot. They are reluctant to hire someone, to train someone, and then to have the person leaving the workplace for 4 years or for more, and that's why they usually don't hire young women. Of course, nobody will tell women that we don't hire you because this reason. They find another reasons to explain their decisions, but in comparison to men of the same age, it could be concluded that women are not hired, especially because of this reason, because of child care leave.
Thank you. I don't know, Charity, if you wanted to add anything. Okay, great. But we have just a couple of minutes left. I see we have one more question, so I'm sure we'll have time to answer only one or two left. The next question is what are the possibilities to develop gender-sensitive initiatives or policies within political parties, or maybe we can expand to even say within government?
Yes, currently the government is more open to develop and implement gender-sensitive initiatives, policies. And policies, we see currently that the government adopted few legal amendments aimed at supporting business to create additional childcare services for their employees, and also to implement the principle equal pay for equal work. It's harder to discuss with the political parties and to convince political parties to adopt internal policies which are more gender sensitive, because most of them, or let's say yes, most of them are more reluctant to implement gender equality principles and to advance gender equality. So the civil society in the Republic of Moldova, business community, and also development partners are conducting permanent raising awareness campaign and information campaigns among all the interested stakeholders to inform them about why it is required and why it is needed to have more gender-sensitive policies.
Thank you. Well, I have one final question. I was curious to ask Yelena and Charity, what, for the gender analysis process, what has been the most challenging element of that, and what was the most interesting element personally for you participating in the process of the gender analysis?
I would say for me, the most interesting part, I'll start with your second question, was connected to how much similarity, we really see about these issues, around the world. This hasn't been my first, project working on, women's economic empowerment, type work, particularly with women entrepreneurs, as that's a sweet spot for foresight. But I did find it very interesting how a lot of the challenges that the Moldovan entrepreneurs we talked to were facing were very similar to challenges I've seen for women entrepreneurs in other parts of the world. So I think that just speaks to, how universal, a lot of our experiences can be, and how, much work we have to do just around the world, like on these topics. And I would say challenging, challenging for me, I guess, would just have been the length of time it took for us to translate the interviews. I am always a big proponent of making sure that you are conducting your interviews in the local languages, because otherwise you don't know if you're not getting the answers to your data appropriately because people don't understand your questions because they're not speaking your language, or your questions are just not good, right? So we wanted to make sure that we were asking the questions in the languages that folks will be most comfortable with talking to us in. But of course, translation and transcription always takes a lot of time to get through, so then you can get to the analysis piece. But I think it is a worthwhile practice to always do when you're doing data collections, particularly when you're working in the international development field.
Thank you. Okay, well, I see that we're at time for this event. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially thank our presenters for sharing the findings of the analysis and presenting their analysis to us. So thank you all again. And if you are interested to access the analysis, it will be available on the WAGE website. As Yelena mentioned, it soon will be available in addition to in English, it will be available in Russian and in Romanian as well. And be sure to follow us on social media as well for the latest updates on our program activities. So thank you again, and have a nice day, everyone.